So as some of you might know, Demyx is actually one of my favorite characters in the series, and I promise you I'm not saying for the sake of the video, Demyx is unironically one of my favorite characters in Kingdom Hearts. Like, I know his boss fights in Kingdom Hearts 2 are pretty annoying, and as someone who's supposed to be a villain, he doesn't really have that air of intimidation about him, and he's definitely more of a comic relief character. But I don't know, I guess that's kinda why I like him. Having this character that really has no reason to be hanging around all of these characters except to provide comedic scenes was just nice to have in a series like Kingdom Hearts. But now, Demyx has become one of the weirder characters in the series, not because of his lighthearted nature or lack of motivation, but because we just really don't know where he's gonna end up going in Phase 2. And this isn't really a theory, more like speculation, getting my thoughts out on Demyx. Because honestly, I think it'd be pretty tough to make a hardcore theory on Demyx simply because of how little material there is of him doing anything significant in the series. Like, of course we see Demyx bring a replica back to Radiant Garden, but that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about his backstory or who Demyx is outside of the organization. There have been theories about Demyx that have been out, but in my honest and completely subjective opinion, there's not enough that happened with him to make a theory that wouldn't feel like a reach. And that in itself kind of has me really excited, because I don't see many people talking about Demyx and his potential because he really is a mystery. I mean, think about it, we know less about Demyx than we do about the Master of Masters at this point. Let that sink in. And again, that has me really excited about what's going to end up happening with him. But before we get into that, make sure to like and subscribe, and with that being said, let's dive right in. So like I said earlier, Demyx hasn't really done much. He's more of a comic relief character than anything. But then in Kingdom Hearts 3, during the cutscene with Demyx, Marluxia, Larxene, and Luke's sword, we got confirmation that Demyx actually has something to do with the ancient Keyblade legacy. Now what exactly that means, none of us are 100% sure, because at this point we know Marluxia and Larxene, or Lauriam and Alrena, were there during the days of Union Cross, but when it comes to people like Luke's sword and Demyx, we don't really know. Maybe they somehow made it out of the data world, or maybe they were Keyblade builders who weren't a part of the Dandelions and never took place in the Keyblade War to begin with. But for whatever reason, we know that they have something to do with the Keyblade builders in the Age of Fairy Tales. And at least with Luke's sword, we know that at some point he ended up in Unreality with Yozora, because we see that happen in the secret episode. But with Demyx, we genuinely have no clue what's going to happen to him in the future of the series. We haven't really gotten any hints on who he could possibly be outside of being the Demyx we already know. But honestly, I feel like there were a couple of routes they could go. One thing that was brought up while I was talking to a couple of friends a while ago was that Demyx could be the sort of Prompto character in Yozora's group. And if you look back at the Demyx trailer, you see Yozora fighting alongside his friends Magia and Aegis. And while I don't think they bear any resemblance to Gladio and Ignis, I think the way they present them is pretty reminiscent of Final Fantasy 15. I think the way they set up the party, where you have the main character, a magic user, and someone who deals with more physical attributes, is definitely going towards something along the lines of Final Fantasy 15, and of course the only one missing would be Prompto. So having Demyx being the Prompto in that group that mirrors Noctis's group could be something that we see in the next game. And when it comes to that ancient Keyblade legacy tying in, maybe he ended up in Quadratum somehow during the Age of Fairy Tales, or sometime after Daybreak Town fell, and ended up integrating into that world and became a part of Yozora's group. And if I'm being entirely honest, I feel like that probably could happen, since there are a lot of similarities drawn between Final Fantasy 15 and Demyx as it is, so it wouldn't surprise me if this was just another one of them. Another theory that I've seen around, and honestly this is my personal favorite, is that Demyx could actually be the Master of Masters. Honestly, there have been a couple of theories on this, and most of them really just point to his demeanor being similar to the Master of Masters. And I'm sure a lot of you are rolling your eyes at this point, but hear me out. Because honestly, I think having Demyx being the Master of Masters would be a twist that I would be okay with. And here's why. Most of the Demyx is the Master of Masters theories I've seen usually point to how their characters emote. They're both very animated and very silly characters who can get serious at the drop of a dime. Well, more so with the Master of Masters than Demyx, but still. And while this isn't necessarily a point against Demyx being the Master of Masters, in my opinion, that isn't really a point in favor of it either. But I'm gonna be honest, I think that having Demyx being the Master of Masters would be really funny, but also kinda cool. Having this person that essentially nobody takes seriously become the main antagonist of the series would be a really fun twist. But I do think it honestly would be a better twist than Sora being the Master of Masters, and this is something I've talked about before, because Sora being the Master of Masters would basically just go from who is the Master of Masters and why is he like this to how did Sora become the Master of Masters. Instead of focusing on a potentially new character and all the implications that come with introducing a new character, we just end up focusing on another version of Sora. And at the end of the day, I do think that having the Master of Masters be a new original character would honestly be a better take than just having it be an existing character. But where Demyx comes in with all of this is that, if we're being honest, he's not new, but he's also kind of the next best thing we have to a new character. Demyx is already kind of a blank slate when it comes to what we actually know about him. The only thing we know about him really is that he's lazy, he doesn't like to fight, and he likes playing his sitar. With Sora, we know his story and we know who he is, so the focus would definitely shift from the Master of Masters to Sora becoming the Master of Masters. But honestly, if it were Demyx, I don't think the focus would shift too much, because we really don't know anything about Demyx to begin with. It would essentially be as close to dealing with a new character as possible without introducing a new character. So am I saying that Demyx is the Master of Masters and that it's definitely going to happen? No, I don't think it will. But honestly, nobody knows where this series is going to go. We could all have really likely predictions and that's fine, but no matter how much we think it's going to happen, nothing's ever 100%. So if that development does end up happening, look, you would not see me complaining. But honestly, there is a development that I'd also be okay with too, and that's if Demyx just ends up not being that important at all. There's always the chance that he was a Keyblade wielder from the Age of Fairy Tales that just escaped by pure happenstance and just happened to end up in this time somehow, and just kind of roll with the punches. And honestly, that wouldn't really betray Demyx's character, because I feel like that's exactly the kind of thing he would do. But either way though, I just kind of wanted to get my thoughts out on Demyx, because even though he's just a gag character, I do think he has a crazy amount of potential to become pretty interesting throughout the future of the series. But what do you guys think? How do you guys feel about Demyx? Let me know down below. But that's gonna be all from me today, so this is Moose Wayne, signing off.